Paper. What is it good for? That is a question we ask ourselves every single day of our lives. Well, it's essential for our daily routine. Not only do we use it to wipe our booty holes and to get our bills down on paper, but it also holds IQ instructions that naturally we ignore, and to write down our maths homework whilst our dad gets impatient and causes us to cry. Yes, it has multiple essential uses in our daily lives, but what's better than to rip it straight from the tree to draw cool doodles on it and call it paper, but cooler? Well, that's what artists do, and we love it. That is our best use of paper out of everything else, more than booty hole wiping. I hope not. Naturally, the world is evolving right now, and we are moving traditional art into digital art, which means we have everything, every material in one app on an iPad, and then you can just draw anything you want, which feels more affordable than buying all these materials in bulk and then not using them. But no matter what, we still use paper so much in our lives as artists. If you work with paper, naturally you're going to want the best quality that you can get. I've heard from a lot of artists on YouTube that it doesn't matter whether you've got really cheap pencils, pens, paints. That doesn't matter if you're working on a bad surface, which includes cheap canvas materials like cheap paper. Many artists do not like that, especially if they're doing mixed media. Since it's so frowned upon, I want to actually see if cheap paper is still worth it. Like, do we just avoid it altogether? Do we have to keep going for the really expensive stuff? No doubt expensive paper is gonna work like a gem and just be perfect for any material to be on it. But we ain't here for expensive paper right now. Is this just an excuse to not buy expensive paper and compare it? Let's just turn a blind eye to all of that right now. We're gonna focus on the cheap paper. So let's get started. Boop. I have here a free sketchbook that I've had since the dawn of time. Obviously, starting out as taking art more seriously, I got the cheapest option available and it cost £8. Right now it's on discount and it's £4, but I got it from this cheap art store that was in town, and this is gonna be the test subject for today. It's done me well for like most of my years. It had coloured pencils on it, and pen. Ultimately, the paper in this sketchbook has only faced pencil, pen and acrylic, so we need to put other mediums to the test. The main test I'm going to be trying out is seeing how it handles mixed media pieces. So I'm talking oil pastels, acrylic paint, pencils, pen, etc. Essentially see how the paper handles application, blending, and how they layer on top of each other, if it can also handle that. However, quick disclaimer, I do not own oil paintings, chalk pastels or gouache. However, I feel acrylic paint, watercolours and other dry materials that I'll be applying could sort of make up for it, if you get what I mean, like as an alternative. I have painted on this paper before with random test pieces that I did in acrylic paint, and overall it seemed to have handled it quite well. I assumed it would like seep through the paper or wear and tear with like too much blending in one area, but I actually handled it not too bad. Although it was quite uncomfortable with applying. I don't know if you get me, but it felt like sandpaper. You know, when you're putting something dry against something dry and it just has that effect. Ugh. It gives me the heebie-jeebies. But if it's got enough thickness, then it feels a bit more gliding and not so bad. So I grabbed one of those test piece acrylic painting to do these experiments, which I am aware that the painting is in black, so it's not going to be able to tell if it does seep through the paper, but we're going to have a hunch. If the paper's wet and it doesn't get any better and it's like tearing away, we can assume that it's not going to handle well. Now our first competitor is the fabulously underrated oil pastels, which only their muscular hand artists are capable of mastering. How does it handle this cheap paper? It does seem to show up nice and bright on paper with my poor handling of the blending. It does seem to blend okay-ish if you know how to blend oil pastels. With layering on itself, I feel it is capable of doing it on the paper. Might need to be a bit careful with how rough you do it. Ultimately, it's again fine with like blending on top of itself. With layering though, any material on top of oil pastels, it just completely rejects it. So naturally on cheap paper, it's not gonna work any better, even with gesso. Fortunately, the gesso doesn't make the color rub off, so it probably secures it quite lovely. It doesn't allow other materials to come on top of it. Oil pastels are their own bitch, they don't want anyone else competing in their zone. So overall, oil pastels handle cheap paper well, but refuses any layers on them, which unfortunately Shrek would be disappointed in this. Competitor 2, a thick amount of acrylic paint. I'm aware I pretty much showed the results of it before, so I'm gonna make this quite quick. As expected, it shows up completely fine on paper. It makes the paper a bit wet, but not in the way that it would seep through the paper. Add enough thickness of paint, then it's okay with blending. If it comes on too dry, then blending is going to be much harder to work with. With the gesso, again, as expected, it just took it absolutely fine. It didn't smudge what was underneath. It does allow work to be done on top, but the layering, it makes it hard to blend on top of acrylic paint. It's very stubborn and just doesn't want to blend. Probably from the cheap paper, as it's not hard enough for it to just allow different layers and surfaces to blend. It just kind of pokes into the paper, if you get me. It kind of creates a dent. Acrylic paint, again, for application, the paper holds it just fine. For layering, blending, the layering, not so much. Blending, it's okay if you add enough thickness of the paint. The third and fourth competitor is pencils, and also coloured pencils, which of course pencil to paper applies pretty well. And I'm not doing this justice by blending with my fingers, but it does show to blend alright. However, it doesn't seem to be getting the strong lines out of the pencil application. It's not getting rid of those lines completely. However, from previous experiences with the portraits I've done in this booklet, it's had trouble blending sometimes, and so we can assume that the paper doesn't really help with blending as much. It could do better. It's not the worst, but it could be better. Adding another medium on top of it, so layering. Because pencil is such a thin layer applied to paper, it's not as thick as oils or acrylic paint. Anything can go on top of it, to be honest. Even on this paper, it works well with layering. However, if you do apply gesso, be careful, because it did rub off onto my finger and it mixes the work you've done underneath that's in pencil. So I do not recommend gesso as like a layering technique for it. So again, blending pencil on the paper, it works moderately okay, it's doable. With layering, it can also be done completely fine on this paper, except anything that's too liquidy. It'll ruin the paper and also ruin the pencil, as it will just smudge it out everywhere and you'd need to redo it all over again. Our fifth competitor is a little problematic, as she needs hydration to function, and that does not work well with cheap paper. Even just application, it makes the paper ridiculously wet and not really workable to go on top of anymore. Any type of layering or blending in the same area, you see little molecules of paper start to wear off. The harder you rub, it just gets off, and can't express enough how watercolour does not work on cheap paper from what we've seen here, which is probably why I haven't done it on this paper before. I think it's very clear to say, if you are a watercolour artist, do not get cheap paper that you're going to assume works for all kinds of mediums, because it won't handle water. There is cheap watercolour paper out there. I own some. Haven't used them yet, because watercolour scares me. But there is cheap alternatives out there for watercolour paper, so definitely go for that and not this paper. The final competitors are a duo, fine line pens and Posca pens. I've used them on paper for a previous piece that I tried, this Spider Punk piece right here, and the fine line doesn't transfer at all. However, the Posca pen is going through the more I lay it into one area. The fine line pen works really well. It works fabulously. This probably won't do Posca pens justice, as the ones I have are quite old and they're like wearing away the more I use it. Little black bits keep coming off of it. I feel it dampens the paper too much as to why it's sort of seeping through to the other side of this paper here. Especially if you go over layering or blending in the same area too much, I don't think the paper can handle it. The white bits where I had to correct it teared the paper a little bit. It made it quite rough. It doesn't look appealing in person. You can really tell there's corrections been done there. They are lovely pens, but I do not believe they work to their best ability on cheap paper, as it dampens it too much and also creates like a sandpapering effect as well. So fine line pen qualifies completely, and I think you can layer on top of it as long as it's not a wet substance. However, Posca pens does overwhelm the paper and works as if it's creating sandpapering and also dampening the paper if you blend and layer in the same kind of areas. So, what have we learnt from this experiment? If there was any material that we used that was wet or felt too dry to the paper, essentially it does not work on cheap paper, as it's just tearing, sanding away the surface it's working on, whilst also dampening or just making the paper weaker, which we don't want that. We want the paper to be sturdy enough to handle it. The watercolour and the Posca pens, they struggle on this type of paper. Therefore, if you do use these mediums quite often, I would invest in a better alternative paper that can handle it. If this video hasn't proven enough, I want to do a full portrait piece using different materials that we've used today in this test. We're putting all that we've learned into practice, and I'm going to be using acrylic paint, pencils, a little bit of white pen, and gesso for the first time. Yee! This is going to be Brad Pitt from Fight Club. Is this an excuse to draw something I've been holding back for a long time? Maybe. But who cares? Who cares? Let's get going. Since we saw that pencil absolutely struggles on acrylic paint, it can't blend or just do anything, I've decided that I'm gonna actually separate the pencil and acrylic and do them on separate parts of the paper. To begin with, I wanna do the background in acrylic and do Brad in pencil. I'm gonna start applying gesso to the areas where I'm gonna do the acrylic paint, as if I do pencil on top of gesso, I feel it would actually give that wet effect, so it'd be really difficult to work on in pencil. I don't want to risk that, so I'm just doing it in the areas where I'm going to be painting. The paper handled it sort of like the acrylic paint, where it got a bit damp and I was a bit concerned that it was going to be bad, but it handled it quite well once it dried, and that's when I felt safe enough to put the paint on it. Like I did in the experiment, I applied the paint in quite a thick amount so I can spread it around a lot easier. So I went with wet paper so it would work out a lot better and just blend a bit more smoothly. Unfortunately, as the paint was being applied and dried over and over again, it was making the paper quite warped, recoiling on itself quite a bit. So clearly this paint drying on the cheap paper is trying to bond it to sort of scrunch up on itself. It was making it super tricky to sort of do the corners, do the soap bar, that's the title, as I had to keep holding down the paper to do the details. It just made life a little bit trickier. I had to do a lot of layers in the soap bar, so I was concerned perhaps that it would seep through this time round. It just never happened. I kept checking and it never seeped through. This paper was handling so much paint on it and it was doing just fine. However, I needed to see how I was going to flatten the paper out, as it was bothering me. That I would leave till the end. I didn't record much of the pencil sketching because this isn't a video of how to draw a face or anything. This is a test video of how the materials work on the paper. So I didn't feel an urge to really show that much of it. You can see the pencil again just worked very fine. I forgot to record the part where I was doing his hair, and that's when it had to of course overlap on the black paint. Naturally the grey pencil isn't going to show up much on black paint anyway. That's when I included the white pen and added highlights to the head to make it quite distinct from what's his hair and what's the background. The white pen, for the most part, it did work on the acrylic paint. It would struggle to come out of the pen sometimes if I did it on the pencil compared to the acrylic paint. Maybe it was too smoothed out of the surface because of the pencil. Anyway, it came out okay. So at this point I've signed off the painting and I've finished it all off. The buckled paper was still bothering me. So I was looking up methods on the internet how to flatten buckled paper. I found a method where you have to spray some water on the back of the paper, which again, this is cheap paper, so I was a bit worried they would ruin the work that was on the opposite side. I put it on a hard surface with paper, then a towel on top, then some heavy things on top of that as well, and left it for 24 hours. Afterwards, here's the results. It worked! See how it's now very much level. It flattened this top bit completely, which thank God for that. It also made this corner not come up so much because I did lean on it a couple of times by accident and it kept bending it forward. I'm surprised that it worked, to be honest, and there you go. Yeah, this is the final piece and I'm pretty happy with the result. Would I say it was difficult to work on this cheap paper? The buckling did make it difficult, the paper doing that on itself. Again, the texture of paper when I paint on it, just that sandpapery feeling, it makes me uncomfortable. It works pretty well for pencils, even though I would like blending to be a lot smoother, but that might be the techniques that I do. And overall, it wasn't half bad. This would be a whole different story if I tried it with watercolor paint. It worked out pretty fine, and that's actually a presentable piece that I'm proud of. What we can conclude from this really about using cheap paper, of course if you have the funds available or a career you need to maintain, putting out good quality work towards your customers, it's definitely ideal to invest in paper that's ideal in holding up a lot more mediums. However, if you want paper to practice on, you're an artist that's starting out, or your medium can handle the paper that I've shown today, then what is the issue? You got no problem, you can use the cheap paper. Even if you work on toilet paper or printer paper, I don't know what your niche is, just use it. Because at the end of the day, it's what you can create using the materials that are available to you, rather than the kind of materials that you use. Don't put pressure on yourself, little artists. Please, it's okay. If I can go all these years still using cheap paper and I'm absolutely fine, then you can too. I hope this was a fun little video for you guys. Next video will be related to Model Week. Subscribe to stick around for future art related content if you enjoyed this video. And if you so desire, please leave a like and a nice little comment under this video. Perhaps there's an artist out there who has more questions to ask and you can help them out in the comments as well. I'll see you around. I love you guys. Mwah. Bye bye.